Hello, I'm Alex Pock, Music Director of Esprit Orchestra, and I have with me a couple of illustrious creative artists, Moira Ness, a visual artist, and Brian Harman, a composer who created a wonderful piece for Esprit's concert series at Kerner Hall, in which Moira's work was projected while Brian's music was performed by the orchestra. It's a wonderful title. Give us the title and tell us what it means. Is it your title, Moira, or yours?
Yeah, it's actually a title of a photo that I took for a totally different series that Brian saw on my website, and I think fell in love with the name, and we went from there.
And so how did you meet? Is it because, Brian, you saw Moira's work on the internet, or did you know each other from before?
Yeah, I found Moira online and was immediately drawn to especially her photography at that time. There were a couple series of her works that dealt a lot with landscape and kind of manipulated the landscape photos that she was taking. And yeah, the title, I hit my head and everything changed, just spoke so well to my interest in, especially in distortion. So both her photos and that title really related quite well to what I was interested in doing musically at the time. And I just sent her an email and said, do you want to work on this project together? And that's how it all started.
Wonderful. And did you actually hit your head, Moira? The text and the kind of graphic distribution of images and what happens, and its parallels in music, of course, but you actually hit your head, and then this process resulted from that?
I mean, I was at a residency in upstate New York in 2017, and I actually did fall down a flight of stairs and hit the back of my head. Luckily, it wasn't a very serious concussion, but I did sort of romanticize it a bit and sort of used it as a creative push-off point. And sort of after that point, I started creating a completely different series, and the name just sort of came to me, and I named a photo after it of that series.
Mm-hmm. So what was the process here between the two of you? Like, Brian, did you have a method of composing you had in mind, and then it connected with Moira's work, or did Moira create these images and you responded to them? And once you got going, did it go back and forth, or how did the form of the work get created and the materials in it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that from the beginning, we didn't really know how we were going to work together exactly. But at first, we really just got to know each other on a more personal level. We clicked really well as humans, not just as artists, and explored a lot of music that we both were interested in, especially popular music. We started to kind of send tracks back and forth and ideas for listening. A little bit of classical music, but I would say it was mostly pop, things from the past, but also things that are a bit more current. And we talked a lot about the lyrics in those songs, but also about our personal connections to them. Like some of them came from my teenage years or Moira's youth, and talked about kind of our personal connections with that music. And I ended up using a lot of that music as source material in the piece. And then I'll let Moira answer, but I believe that material was useful to her as well.
But the material that you brought in from the outside, not your music, what process drove your compositional part and the materials of your own that you combined with the so-called borrowed material?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in curation as a compositional process. So the music, there's pretty much all of the music in the piece is based on these pieces, these songs or pieces that we had talked about early in the process. And I love distortion as a musical technique in general. I'm really fascinated by different ways of combining music, superimposing music, playing with time and temporality, stretching it out in time, different types of layers. And so I was really able to use those songs pretty much primarily as my source material for this piece. And I think it turned out to be kind of a weird hodgepodge of music, but I think somehow it all works together. I really like the idea of bringing together things that are very disparate and making them kind of work together in an unusual way. So yeah, it had a lot to do with distortion and playing with time on a musical scale.
And your musical elements, they kind of submerge and then they emerge and create this layered field of events and activity and forms and moods and atmospheres. And what's interesting, Moira, is that the same thing happens with your graphic material, because sometimes things are very clear for you to read, and then they fall apart kind of, or dissolve, and then they can either be dissolving or forming. And there are different layers and levels of intensity. And what I found interesting was as the music progressed and your images changed, that, well, there were these moments of great intensity and flurry and activity, and then things could calm down a bit. And it's very interesting how you achieve this graphically with something that seems to be very personal, and yet that the viewer can also then remove oneself to be in an abstract world, and then you can go back into being into the very personal world. And it's the same with music. But Moira, I think this process to achieve that visually, I mean, in music, there are certain responses that we've learned from listening to music of all kinds, but visually, I'm not sure that that's such a common thing.
Well, it was interesting because I actually didn't know what slides would line up with the music exactly. So it actually brought out new meaning to different slides where it sort of lined up on the time, which I thought was amazing. And some of them, just sort of cycled through, but there were some very, as you said, intense moments where, how did that line up? It was very happenstance, but an amazing outcome, and very moving, and added meaning to the visual from the music, wherever the music was at that point.
You suggested at one point that there's a kind of a through line in the progression of images or words or the way the graphics flow, and that there are different layers. There's like a dichotomy of materials and activities in both the visuals and music. Moira, first, can you talk about that, like the through line or the progression of what, a storyline or activity line, and then the two layers, and then Brian, maybe you can talk how your music parallels that.
Yeah, so originally it actually was meant to be, on my end at least, telling a story, a very rough story and open for interpretation by the viewer, but there is definitely intention with the placement of each image. But as I said before, like the lineup of the music was so, made it so much more, and added a different sort of layer of complexity and interpretation that was really up to the viewer. It was coaxed along by Brian's, the moments that Brian created rather. Yeah, I thought the story came out, but also even individually, the slides can be viewed with the moment of music as an individual moment. So there's lots of ways to approach it, which I think is really interesting. And maybe if people view the little excerpt that we have as a full story, it might tell something different, or they might grab a single visual and lock onto that. I'll let Brian.
There was a kind of form that Stockhausen named at one point, and it was in fact called moment form, in which the activity of the music was not exactly 1 minute long, but the immersion in that particular activity for any duration was the moment, because it held its own particular unique characteristics. So I think I can see that visually, and I think that's audible in the music as well, because it's not segmented, but as you progress, you can stay in a moment before you go to the next in the music. Is that how you thought about it, Brian?
Yes, yeah, like Moira was saying, just to kind of echo a little bit what she was saying about the collaboration, we didn't necessarily know exactly how the images and the music would line up. And I think that was a really exciting part of the project for us, where we kind of came up with a loose idea of how we wanted things to unfold. But her images, I got some previews early on, but they were always a bit of a mystery to me. I didn't get to see the full thing before the final product was created. And I think the same for her. Like, I kind of sent her, I think, some MIDI samples, but it's never the same thing. So that was kind of exciting to hear the piece come together in both mediums and to see how they match up or don't match up. But yeah, I really agree with what Moira is saying, is that there is kind of a progression. There definitely was an intuitive form in place. You do have a climax, which is kind of approximately 3/4 of the way through the piece, and it's not so unusual a form. Definitely is intuitive. There's no kind of calculations there. But at the same time, because I was using rather, use the word segmented, Alex, and I think that's quite accurate, actually. There really is kind of segments of the piece where there's different source materials that are used in a different kind of environment, musical environment that's created. And to take just that section, I think is interesting to look at that with the visuals that go along with it. And view that as a moment, I think is also applicable and a beautiful way of looking at the work, for sure.
But the other thing about it is that all of this happens in a continuous flow of texture, in a way, so that you, in that flow and in that atmosphere or whatever of textures, you get these fine details. In the visual stuff, Moira, what's the there's this thing called text sorting that you mentioned in program notes, algorithms, text sorting algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not trying to get you to reveal the mysteries of your the secrets of your, but what is it? I mean, like, I'm thinking about this just because technology is being used here, in ways that may be new to people, new to me. I never saw anything like that, where there was there's an organic process, even though these are still images, as you go through, and even as if you look at one slide of your work, there seems to be an organic thing going on. It's very
Well, it actually, it goes into a little bit to the collaboration itself. Brian and I both contributed text to the final product. So he would upload a certain amount of text that he wanted to include. I would also do the same. And this algorithm would blend it together. Really a true form of collaboration, where we're both using different, or it's both using different source material from both of us, and then spitting it out in a different form, but still together. So I would select sentences that would make sense coming out of this sort of jumble of words. And then I would move that into an image-based algorithm through Photoshop, which is an image editing software. And a specific setting on that was applied to the visual text, and it made that sort of disperse of different lines and expanding the text visually, and that's what you saw. And it spat it out sometimes, as you were saying, in a very complex way. So it takes up the whole screen takes over the whole moment. But then sometimes it was very simple, and it was, you could see the words very clearly, and it was just a little bit of dispersion of the images, and that was always by chance. It was, I could never control that, and that's part of why the algorithm was so interesting, is that I might have applied the algorithm 20 times to the same photo. Each time it would give something different, and I would choose one that I thought was interesting, or just spoke to me visually.
Interesting. And Brian, you didn't use any external machinery. You did it all inside your brain, right? Your thing.
I did,
Is that right?
except for notating the piece. Yeah, but I was quite inspired by this idea of algorithm, and when, as I was kind of manipulating some of these materials and cutting them up and reordering them, it often reflected that kind of process.
Yeah.
You know, taking something and rearranging the musical phrases in different ways. Yeah, so there's definitely some sort of relationship there with Moira's process.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about that dichotomy that you mentioned at one point, Moira. There's a dichotomy of within the piece, like of two different things to perceive, two layers.
Together as a collaboration. I think speaking back to when Brian was talking about how when we first met and we learned a little bit about each other, we shared writing, we shared experiences, we just got to know each other, and then we kind of did our own thing, and it came together in the end, and it just, I think it worked so well. I still watch my projection quite often, and it's just an amazing coming together of two different mediums, disciplines. It was an amazing outcome, and I'm really just grateful that we were able to do it with you guys as well, and you guys perform it. It was so wonderful.
I hope we can do it again at some point when
I agree.
the pandemic is over. What for both of you, what is the relationship of this piece to the things that you're moving forward with creatively now? I know that Moira, you do really a wide range of things. So is this something that hasn't, I know that, you know, the next project might be nothing like this, but is there something from this that has an impact on where you're going with your work?
Well, directly, actually, I'm using some of the slides in an art exhibition for Design TO coming up in January. So it'll just be the visual, a few slides that they've selected out of what I submitted in my application. But future works, I've actually started exploring more manual ways of creating sort of the sort of visual algorithm that I created on a digital platform. So I'm getting into sort of drafting, like using pens and different like architectural like drafting tools, and making sort of repetitive lines and marks to kind of mimic what the computer created on Photoshop. I kind of wanted to try it out myself and see how using text and adding to it. So it was actually a very big influence in my current work, and definitely moving forward for sure.
Great. And Brian, how about you?
Yeah, so this idea of using source material from elsewhere, I find it really satisfying as a composer to be able to not be generating everything yourself. I love the editing process, taking a piece of music and editing it in some way, or orchestrating it, or distorting it, or, you know, submerging it underwater metaphorically. I love working in that way. And this piece was kind of a very extreme version of that, where I was able to take this music that kind of means a lot to me and play with it in all sorts of different ways. And I just find that so satisfying as an artist. Yeah, so I'm definitely planning to work in similar ways in the future. Yes.
Well, I'm sure looking forward to hearing and seeing where your work goes, both of you, and hope we have a chance to work together again before long. And thank you for enlightening me and our listeners and viewers. Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so
Alex.
much. Thanks for having us.
Bye now.